Welcome to Project Blackwood. Open the file in front of you. We are going to start by tracing a really stark, almost brutal juxtaposition in the evidence today.
Yeah, I've got the physical ledgers right here.
Okay, so I want you to picture a very specific date in recent economic history, November 16th, 2021.
Right, the absolute peak of the mountain.
Exactly. The company detailed in this dossier is the undisputed king of the pandemic retail landscape. If you trace the ledgers from that exact quarter, they're boasting a staggering $106 billion in revenue.
It's just a massive number.
It is. Their stock price has hit an all-time high of $238.01. Their physical stores have been transformed into these impenetrable, hyper-efficient logistical fortresses. They're essentially keeping the American consumer supplied while the rest of the global supply chain is fracturing into pieces. They're completely untouchable.
But then, if you turn the page to the 2024 and 2025 data sets, the landscape is entirely unrecognizable.
It's bleak.
Yeah, that's stock price. It is hovering around $120.80. It has literally been slashed in half. And unearthing their profit margins, which had been this incredibly robust 8.4% during that pandemic high.
Unheard of for big box retail, by the way.
Right. You find they have utterly collapsed down to 3.5%. And the corporate workforce is bleeding. We're looking at 1,800 corporate jobs quietly eliminated amid extensive restructuring.
So we are tracking a brand that is paralyzed. They are choking on new supply chain tariffs. They're entirely structurally misaligned with consumer spending habits and suffering from a profound internal identity crisis.
Which brings us to the core mystery of this entire investigation. The question you have to ask when confronted with this scale of value destruction.
How does a company that literally invented the modern indoor shopping mall, a company that masterminded the entire concept of the upscale discount model, pay billions of dollars to discover that its greatest strength, its carefully curated aesthetic, was actually a fatal vulnerability?
It is the foundational question, because when you comb through the physical evidence we have here on the table, I mean the financial matrices, the margin notes on these M&A documents, the internal cybersecurity logs.
You do not see a sudden, unpredictable lightning strike that took them down.
No, not at all. What emerges from the data are structural, deeply embedded choices that were made decades ago. You find a company that built a global empire on a very specific kind of confidence. And you watch that confidence slowly mutate into a dangerous, blinding overreach.
So let's follow that thread back to the absolute beginning, because the origins detailed in this file are not what you would expect for a retail behemoth.
Right. Sifting through the founding documents here, we're looking at June 1857. The birth of George Draper Dayton.
Now, the anomaly here is that George Dayton wasn't a merchant. He wasn't a retailer at all.
He was a banker.
He was a banker and a real estate investor handling farm mortgages in Worthington, Minnesota. He had absolutely no grand, sweeping vision of a retail empire.
And the catalyst for everything that follows is actually a localized economic and physical disaster. There's a historical footnote here in the margin detailing the Panic of 1893.
Let's unpack the gravity of that for a second. The Panic of 1893 wasn't just some minor recession.
No, until the 1930s, it was considered the worst economic depression in American history.
Railroads were collapsing, bank runs were rampant, credit completely froze.
And right in the middle of this catastrophic economic freeze, the Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis burns to the ground.
And Dayton is an active parishioner there.
Right. And what he does next defies conventional business logic for the era. He buys the adjacent empty corner lot. He doesn't do this because he has a grand commercial strategy. He does it purely to inject desperately needed, highly illiquid capital into the church's coffers so they can rebuild.
He essentially acts as a one-man bailout for his congregation.
Exactly. He then erects a massive 6-story building on that site. But he doesn't even purchase his first retail operation, Goodfellow Dry Goods, until almost a decade later in 1902. And the paperwork shows he only executes that buyout because he needs a tenant to fill his massive empty building.
The entire foundation of this $100 billion retail conglomerate was an accident of real estate preservation and religious philanthropy.
It is incredible to think about.
And you can see that religious, civic-minded origin hard-coded into the company's DNA very early on. If you isolate the 1946 policy documents, George's successor, Nelson Dayton, formalizes a deeply rigid corporate mandate,
dedicating exactly 5% of all pre-tax income to community giving.
Now, on the surface, you could read that and think, well, that's just an early version of brilliant corporate PR, right? Just building goodwill.
But that is a fundamental misreading of the evidence. You cannot analyze this 1946 mandate through the modern lens of public relations or ESG initiatives. The internal communications frame this as a rigid Presbyterian mandate. It was a moral obligation baked directly into the corporate charter.
And if we connect this to the broader psychological profile of the company, it explains so much of their subsequent behavior over the next 80 years.
It really does. Yes, it established an incredibly deep well of public trust. But it also hard-coded a sense of absolute moral certainty into the executive suite. It created a culture that fundamentally believed and inherently knew what was best for the community and, by extension, the consumer.
And that kind of unshakable confidence is a massive asset when you're defining a brand. But as the data will reveal later, it becomes a lethal liability when the market stops agreeing with your vision and you absolutely refuse to pivot.
That exact confidence is what drives their defining strategic divergence. Let's isolate the market data from 1962.
This is one of the most bizarre anomalies in American business history.
It really is. In this single calendar year, 1962, 4 massive retail concepts are born simultaneously. Target, Walmart, Kmart, and Woolco, they all step up to the starting line at the exact same moment.
And this is where you have to cross-reference the market analysis from their merchant executive at the time, John F. Geiss.
Because while Sam Walton takes Walmart into the underserved rural race to the absolute bottom on price, quietly building a geographic monopoly in towns other retailers ignored, Geiss analyzes the same national landscape and deliberately refuses to play that game.
The internal memos show he doesn't want the blue-collar rural market, and he actively rejects Kmart's sprawling, utilitarian, bare-bones suburban footprint. Geiss targets a very specific demographic, the rapidly expanding, affluent suburban middle class.
He invents the concept of the upscale discount model.
Upscale discount. I mean, it sounds like a total oxymoron on paper.
Right, but tracing their early store designs, they execute it flawlessly. The blueprints show cleaner stores, significantly wider aisles, trend-forward apparel. They realize early on that they don't just want to sell you a toaster. They want to sell you a toaster that you are proud to display on your kitchen counter.
And the initial velocity is staggering. By 1965, just 3 years after launch, the ledgers report their first profit, $39 million in sales across just 5 physical locations.
But if you trace the financials a little further down the timeline, a massive warning light blinks on the dashboard. Isolate the ledger for 1972. Exactly 10 years after they launched this revolutionary concept, they report their very first decrease in corporate profits.
And the reason documented in the operational logs is critical to our investigation. Why did profits suddenly drop?
Severe overstocking and elevated storage costs. The problem became so acute they had to institute a temporary freeze on all new store openings.
I want to explicitly bookmark this 1972 margin note for you. Hold on to this specific operational failure. They suffered a severe profit collapse because they hoarded too much inventory, misjudged consumer demand for their curated aesthetic, and physically couldn't move the product out of the warehouses.
It seems like a minor operational hiccup in the early 70s.
But this exact same structural blind spot, this deeply ingrained tendency to over-leverage their inventory of discretionary fun goods, is going to rise from the graves and nearly destroy the company exactly 50 years later.
Because it is the DNA of the company revealing itself. They love their curated aesthetic so much that they occasionally blind themselves to the raw, unglamorous mechanics of supply and demand. Warehouse space is like water in a bathtub. When it's full, you can't just turn on the faucet harder. The system floods.
And if you skip ahead in the dossier to the 2008 and 2009 recession data, you see this exact vulnerability tested on a massive macroeconomic scale.
Let's trace that impact. The 2008 financial crisis hits. The mortgage market collapses.
The file shows this retailer immediately hemorrhaging market share to Walmart. The psychological shift in the consumer is instantaneous. When the economy crashes and unemployment spikes, financially strapped consumers instantly abandon the cheap chic aesthetic.
They no longer care about a designer apparel collaboration or a beautifully curated home decor aisle. They care about the absolute lowest possible price on a gallon of milk, a box of cereal, and basic household necessities.
The company is suddenly structurally misaligned with the brutal economic reality,
which triggers an existential threat from the outside. Pulling up the proxy fight dossier from 2009 introduces a fascinating antagonist, Bill Ackman.
running the activist hedge fund Pershing Square Capital Management.
Right, he steps into the arena. And to understand his motivation, you have to look at Pershing Square's position at the time. His fund had taken a massive beating in the recession, losing something like 90% of its value in certain securities.
He is bleeding, he is furious, and he launches a hostile proxy fight against the board of directors.
Ackman's central demand is a masterpiece of ruthless financial engineering. He wants them to take their most valuable hidden asset, the physical real estate, the actual land and buildings under their stores, and spin it off into a real estate investment trust, or a REIT.
Let's unpack the mechanics of a REIT for a second, because it is vital to understanding what is at stake here. Imagine you own your house free and clear. It is a great asset, but your cash flow is extremely tight.
An investor comes along and says, "Sell me your house for a massive pile of cash today, and I will lease it back to you so you can still live there. You just have to pay me rent every month."
You get an immediate cash windfall, but you are now permanently burdened with lease payment, and you lose total control over the property. You cannot even knock down a wall without the landlord's permission.
Ackman wanted to do that with hundreds of big box retail locations. Doing that unlocks immediate, massive shareholder value. It artificially inflates the stock price by monetizing the dirt they sit on.
Ackman wants to fundamentally alter the corporate structure to generate a cash windfall for his fund.
And the boardroom dynamics of this proxy vote are incredibly tense, but management fights back aggressively. Their counter-argument is that selling off their real estate and leasing it back is a highly risky, short-sighted maneuver.
They argue it sacrifices long-term operational stability and physical flexibility for a quick payday.
They take it to a proxy vote with the shareholders, and against the odds, management wins. They defeat Ackman. They retain absolute ownership of the real estate.
The structural irony of this 2009 boardroom brawl is unbelievable when you cross-reference it with future events. Winning this specific fight against an activist investor is the only thing that saves the company from total annihilation a decade later.
Exactly. Because they retained total ownership and control of their physical real estate, they possessed the massive, unencumbered physical footprint required to turn those stores into micro-fulfillment centers when the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020.
If Ackman had won in 2009, they would have been mere tenants in their own buildings.
They would have been legally barred by rigid lease agreements from tearing out store aisles to build industrial logistics hubs in the backrooms.
They would have entered the pandemic without the physical flexibility necessary to fulfill massive digital orders, and they likely would have been completely wiped out by Amazon. It was an accidental salvation born from corporate stubbornness.
But surviving Ackman and the Great Recession seemed to inject the C-suite with a dangerous level of hubris, which leads us into one of the most brutal sections of this entire investigation.
Yeah, unearthing the 2011 mergers and acquisitions data, you see a massive pivot. They decide it's time to expand internationally. They look north to Canada.
They authorize a $1.8 billion acquisition of up to 220 leaseholds from the Hudson's Bay Company, essentially taking over dilapidated Old Zellers retail locations.
And here is where you have to stop and scrutinize the project timeline. The M&A paperwork officially closes in 2011. The executive mandate, driven aggressively by CEO Greg Steinhafel, is to renovate and open 124 of these massive Canadian stores in a single year, 2013.
Point. 124 stores in 12 months.
That is the executive mandate.
We need to pause right there because functionally, mathematically, that is impossible. You cannot stand up an international supply chain of that magnitude in a single calendar year.
It defies every basic law of logistics.
It defies infrastructure scaling, software testing protocols. You cannot build the localized vendor relationships from scratch, test the distribution center robotics, and hire and train the workforce required for that sheer volume of square footage in that time frame.
It is a mathematically impossible mandate driven by pure corporate arrogance.
And the forensic evidence of the failure proves that completely right. Let's dig into the mechanics of what actually broke, because it is essentially an autopsy of catastrophic IT management. To run this brand new Canadian empire, the C-suite decided to deploy a brand new SAP Enterprise Resource Planning System.
Think of an ERP not just as a piece of software, but as the central nervous system of a modern corporation. It tracks a product from the manufacturing plant to the shipping container, to the warehouse shelf, to the cash register.
If the data in that nervous system is corrupted, The physical body of the company becomes paralyzed.
And because of the impossible 12-month deadline Steinhaffel mandated, they completely bypassed critical infrastructure testing and deployed this immensely complex SAP system with an entirely untrained, rushed staff.
The data entry logs from this period are terrifying to read.
The system required absolute microscopic precision, but the temporary clerks were manually entering product data with fatal flaws. Product dimensions were entered in inches instead of centimeters.
Wait, they were manually typing inches into a metric system database?
Yes, length, width, and height orders for specific items were routinely transposed in the spreadsheets. The system was mixing up US and Canadian currencies on automated purchase orders.
So what does that data corruption actually mean on the physical ground? It means the automated supply chain physically stopped functioning. Because the central database thought a standard kitchen toaster was 15 feet long instead of 15 centimeters, the software couldn't calculate how to efficiently pack the pallets or the delivery trucks.
The physical result was apocalyptic for a retailer. They had 4 million square feet of brand new warehouse space, literally overflowing to the ceiling, with goods that the software system could not route to the stores.
Meanwhile, the actual store shelves across Canada sat completely bare.
And Canadian consumers who were highly anticipating the glossy, well-stocked, upscale discount experience they knew from crossing the border into the US for decades, walked into these empty, chaotic stores.
They saw bare shelves, they saw higher local price points than the US stores, and they instantly, permanently abandoned the brand. The cash burn was astronomical. The ledgers show they accumulated over $2.1 billion in operating losses almost immediately.
Which forces an inevitable regime change. Brian Cornell is brought in as the new CEO specifically to stop the bleeding, and you have to read his January 2015 public statement slowly to fully grasp the sheer magnitude of this defeat.
I have it here. He says, after extensive internal review, we have concluded that we are unable to find a realistic scenario that would get Target Canada to profitability until at least 2021.
The brand that thought it could conquer an entirely new country in 12 months is admitting total unconditional surrender.
They filed for creditor protection under the company's Creditors Arrangement Act. They liquidated 133 stores.
And when you tally up the collateral damage of the Canadian exit, let's not gloss over the human toll here. 17,600 employees were terminated. And the financial ledger recorded a $5.4 billion pre-tax loss.
That is not just a failed expansion, that is wealth destruction on a historic scale.
But digging into the timestamps across these files, there is a terrifying overlap. The Canadian disaster didn't happen in a vacuum.
While the supply chain in Canada is quietly imploding in late 2013, track the Q4 2013 data back in the US, there is a massive anomaly in the cybersecurity logs.
This is a major inflection point in the dossier, between November 27 and December 15, 2013.
The exact same weeks the Canadian shelves are sitting inexplicably empty.
Cybercriminals infiltrate the corporate network back home.
How do they even get in?
They use credentials stolen from a third-party HVAC vendor. Someone fixing the air conditioning at a few store locations had remote network access for billing and monitoring, and the hackers used that tiny overlooked backdoor to deploy what is known as black POS malware directly onto unpatched Windows point-of-sale systems across the entire country.
The scale of the exposure is staggering. 110 million customers had their data compromised. And this wasn't just names and emails. This included triple DES encrypted pins.
Think of triple DES encryption as locking a document in a highly secure safe, putting that safe inside a larger vault, and burying it under a mountain. It is incredibly secure.
But if the person holding the map to the mountain leaves it on the passenger seat of their unlocked car, which is essentially what the HVAC credential theft was, the strength of the vault doesn't matter. The perimeter was breached.
But this raises a glaring question. How does a modern, technically sophisticated corporation miss an intrusion of that magnitude during the busiest, most critical holiday shopping season of the year?
Here is the smoking gun, and it is arguably the most damning single piece of evidence in the entire file. They didn't miss it.
The internal security logs show that their own advanced FireEye security service triggered explicit, undeniable warnings. The digital tripwires worked perfectly.
The alarms were flashing red in the corporate security operations center.
Yeah.
The security team completely ignored them.
It is a systemic failure of institutional response. This is a classic case of alert fatigue compounded by executive distraction. They had spent millions building the digital tripwires, But the human element, the management structure tasked with monitoring them, was either too paralyzed by the volume of alerts or entirely distracted by the unfolding apocalypse in Canada to react to the alarms in their own basement.
The external reality hit them like a freight train. Holiday transaction volume immediately plummeted by 5.5% as panic spread among consumers.
Q4 profits dropped 46%.
They eventually incurred over $200 million in net expenses just trying to clean up the technical and legal wreckage.
Trace the panic in the C-suite. Greg Steinhoffel, the CEO who aggressively mandated the impossible Canadian expansion, is now presiding over the worst data breach in retail history. He's ousted by the board of directors in May 2014.
And if you read the Q1 2014 earnings call transcript, you can hear interim CEO John Mulligan desperately trying to mask the hemorrhage to Wall Street.
He states, "The first quarter was unusually challenging as we worked hard to help our guests recover from the data breach."
Unusually challenging is an incredible piece of corporate understatement for an event that functionally forced an industry-wide transition to chip-and-pin credit card technology across the United States and decapitated the executive leadership of the company.
It really is. Now, as we're combing through this structural analysis, unearthing the various operational arms of the company, there's a glitch in the file. A section that absolutely does not seem to belong in a retail dossier.
I'm flipping to Section 6 here. The Forensic Services Laboratory, established in 2003.
Yes, I flagged this anomaly immediately. When you first read the phrase Retail Forensics Lab, you naturally assume it's just a glorified loss prevention office. A windowless room with some security guards reviewing grainy camera footage to catch teenage shoplifters.
But verifying the impossible here, this is not mall security. This is an ASCLD lab accredited crime lab.
Let's clearly define what that acronym means for you. SCLD Lab accreditation is the absolute gold standard for criminal forensics. There are only about 400 operations worldwide that have earned this rating.
This retail corporation operates one of only a few dozen private organizations globally cleared to this stringent international standard. They operate state-of-the-art laboratory facilities in Minneapolis and Las Vegas.
They conduct latent fingerprint analysis, highly complex smartphone data extraction, and forensic audio-video enhancement.
Their primary mandate, naturally, is internal shrink, combating the sophisticated, organized retail crime rings that cost them nearly $1 billion in 2023 alone.
But what's truly bizarre, what leaps out of the documentation, is their external synergy with law enforcement under their Target and Blue initiative. They literally process violent felonies for domestic police departments pro bono.
There is an evidence log here regarding a specific case with the Houston Police Department, a violent, complex arson case.
The Houston PD recovered surveillance tapes from a local convenience store, but the tapes were severely damaged by the fire and the water used to extinguish it. They sent them to the FBI for analysis.
The FBI's lab failed to restore the tapes.
So the Houston police sent the physical evidence to this retailer's sub-basement forensics lab, and their private technicians successfully restored the video, allowing state investigators to identify and arrest the suspects.
Let's analyze the psychological profile this reveals about the corporation. Why does a retailer train the FBI? Why are their executives hosting seminars teaching local police chiefs how to link disparate state and county databases to track repeat offenders?
It reveals a chilling, deeply ingrained obsession with absolute control, extreme localized precision, and systemic tracking.
It is a massive, almost absurd contradiction. You have a company possessing such microscopic, godlike technological control that they can reconstruct melted arson tapes better than the federal government, but simultaneously they were entirely incapable of tracking their own basic inventory in Canada because a temporary clerk typed inches instead of centimeters into a spreadsheet.
It highlights the inherent danger of compartmentalized brilliance within a massive bureaucracy. The tactical units at the bottom, the lab technicians, the store designers, the localized security teams are operating at a world-class, unprecedented level.
But the macroscopic strategic vision at the top, the C-suite pushing the unscalable Canada expansion or ignoring the blinking fire eye alarms, was fundamentally disconnected from operational reality.
So following the timeline, after the bloodbath of 2014 and 2015, Brian Cornell takes over permanently, and he initiates a massive, aggressive course correction.
He announces an $8 billion capital injection to remodel existing stores, purchase the same-day delivery platform shipped, and fundamentally turn the physical footprint into a localized logistics network.
Which brilliantly sets the stage for the pandemic mirage.
Moving into the 2019 to 2021 data, this is where the narrative shifts from desperate recovery to unprecedented historic acceleration. Track the quote from Cornell in 2019, right before the pandemic functionally alters the global economy.
He outlines the strategy perfectly. During the fourth quarter, stores fulfilled roughly 75% of orders, effectively doing the work of 14 fulfillment centers and essentially eliminating the need to invest $3 billion for new warehouses.
He notes in the internal metrics that shipping off the back of local stores is more than 40% cheaper per unit than upstream shipping from central warehouses, and drive-up costs nearly 90% less.
This is the ultimate payoff of beating Bill Ackman back in 2009. They have the real estate. And when the COVID-19 lockdowns hit in 2020, shutting down traditional commerce, this system operates like a machine perfectly designed for the crisis.
The resulting metrics are explosive. In 2021, the revenue line crosses the $100 billion threshold for the first time in corporate history, hitting $106 billion. Net income skyrockets to an all-time record of $6.946 billion. The stock price hits that $238.01 peak.
To Wall Street, they look like they have permanently conquered the retail landscape.
But stop at the 2022 financials. The rug is pulled out from under them with terrifying speed. Operating margins plummet from 8.4% down to 3.5%. Net income drops from nearly $7 billion down to $2.78 billion.
The revelation here is almost poetic in its tragedy. Drunk on the hyper-growth of the pandemic lockdowns, the buying algorithms and the executive merchants succumbed to the bullwhip effect in their supply chain.
They anticipated that the massive stimulus-fueled consumer behavior of 2020 and 2021 was a permanent paradigm shift. They hoarded massive amounts of bulky discretionary goods, expensive patio furniture, high-end apparel, bulky home decor.
But when 2022 arrived, the macroeconomic reality shifted violently. Inflation spiked. The government stimulus checks dried up. Consumers suddenly stopped buying fun, aesthetic things and started ruthlessly prioritizing basic survival: groceries, gas, rent.
And this company was caught holding millions of square feet of inventory that nobody wanted and nobody could afford.
It is the exact, undeniable echo of the 1972 overstock crisis we bookmarked earlier, magnified by a factor of 10,000. The company's foundational reliance on high-margin discretionary items, the very aesthetic curation that earned it the cultural nickname Target, became a massive financial anchor around its neck.
Because holding stale inventory in a warehouse physically prevents new, relevant goods from entering the system, they refused to wait it out. They initiated brutal, margin-crushing liquidation markdowns just to clear the physical warehouses, slaughtering their profitability in the process.
And that operational vulnerability bleeds right into the final unraveling we see in the current 2024 and 2025 data. The external pressures begin compounding dramatically.
In 2023, the company faced a severe consumer boycott regarding the merchandising of their Pride collection.
Tracking the operational impact purely through the data, this resulted in physical store confrontations, an immediate measurable hit to quarterly foot traffic, and subsequent class action lawsuits filed by shareholders concerning the board's risk management of ESG initiatives.
Which forces them into a defensive crouch just as the macroeconomic environment worsens even further. Digging into the supply chain vulnerability exposed in the 2024 files, you find the tariff trap.
Walmart, their primary competitor, relies heavily on domestic, recession-proof groceries and local agricultural supply chains.
But this company has historically sourced up to 60% of its private label, high-margin discretionary goods directly from manufacturing centers in China.
When geopolitical tensions rose and aggressive new Section 301 tariffs were implemented, they were hit disproportionately hard compared to their competitors. Their cost of goods sold spiked dramatically, and they couldn't simply pass all those new costs onto a consumer base that was already exhausted by years of inflation.
So the human cost returns to the ledger. We look at the 2024 and 2025 contraction data. The architect of the pandemic peak, CEO Brian Cornell, steps down, transitioning to executive chairman, and Michael Fidelk takes over the reins.
But the transition is marked by deep cuts. 1,800 corporate jobs are quietly eliminated. They initiate broad restructuring efforts. They're desperately trying to shrink their way back to operational profitability.
Closing the file on the present day, what are the final metrics we're looking at? Trailing 12-month revenue for 2025 is stagnating at $105.24 billion. They are struggling to find any meaningful top-line growth.
And the stock price is hovering around $120.80. The market has repriced their future, and the market is profoundly skeptical.
It makes you wonder about the alternate timelines hidden in these decisions. Explore the what-if path here. What if Bill Ackman had won that hostile proxy fight back in 2009? What if he had forced the sale and leaseback of the real estate?
If Ackman had won, They would have generated a massive short-term cash windfall. And the executives of that era would have undoubtedly been celebrated on the covers of financial magazines as geniuses.
But they would have entered the 2020 pandemic without ownership of the physical stores necessary to fulfill digital orders. Without that localized fulfillment capability, the upstream shipping costs from centralized warehouses would have bankrupted them during the lockdowns.
They likely would have been entirely wiped out by Amazon, absorbed into the graveyard of obsolete big-box retailers like Sears and Kmart. Winning the fight against short-term financial engineering is what allowed them to survive, even if their own internal hubris caused them to stumble terribly afterward.
And if you draw a parallel to the modern landscape, you see similar systemic warnings flashing red for other premium brands, cross-referencing this with a company like Starbucks or Nike.
Both are iconic brands that built absolute global empires on premium positioning, carefully curated aesthetics, and rapid, aggressive expansion.
But just like the retailer in this dossier, both Starbucks and Nike currently find themselves burdened by immense structural bloat. They are paralyzed by a sudden macroeconomic shift, where consumers are suddenly prioritizing absolute value and utility over the aesthetic, premium experience.
They built massive, complex machines designed solely for limitless high-margin growth, and they don't know how to operate those machines in a world that suddenly demands basic efficiency and lowest possible prices.
It is a terrifying reality check for the C-suite.
Consider the inherent fragility of any system that values limitless growth over operational stability. What does the evaporation of this retail giant's dominance, its collapse under the weight of its own unread inventory and historic hubris, say about our collective, often fatal obsession with progress at any cost?
It's definitely something to think about.
This has been Project Blackwood.